Hello, this is a revision video on Sonnet 29 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I'm going to read the poem first of all and then talk through a few annotations. As ever with any of these videos, they're intended to be a rough guide. They're simply not an exhaustive way to talk about the poem, and any extra interpretations that you come up with will always be favourable. Your interpretations are much more convincing to an examiner than anybody else's, as long as they're well supported. The poem is Sonnet 29, I Think of Thee. I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud about thee as wild vines about a tree. Put out broad leaves, and soon there's naught to see except the straggling green which hides the wood. Yet, O my palm tree, be it understood, I will not have my thoughts instead of thee, who art dearer, better. Rather, instantly renew thy presence, as a strong tree should. Rustle thy boughs, and set thy trunk all bare, and let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down, burst, shattered, everywhere. Because, in this deep joy to see and hear thee, and breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I am too near thee. So, simply what it's all about is the speaker in this poem is writing about an absent lover. The thoughts of the speaker are wrapped around the lover like vines on a tree, but the speaker still misses the lover. A little bit of background information. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born in County Durham in 1806, but she moved to Herefordshire as a child. She was frail, but she wrote poems from a very early age, from the age of 4, I believe. She wrote against child labour and she was against the slave trade, which was controversial given that a lot of her family were benefiting from the slave trade and had money and business in Jamaica. Robert Browning admired her poetry and wrote to her to compliment her. The two courted, so they met and they dated and they married in secret, as she knew that her father wouldn't approve. They moved to Italy, and as Elizabeth predicted, her father did disinherit her, as he did with any of her siblings that married. This poem is from a collection called Sonnets from the Portuguese, and it's a collection of 44 love poems, and Elizabeth wrote them privately, and it was her husband, Robert Browning, who encouraged her to publish them. The title suggests two things. One is that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wanted people to believe that they'd been written in Portuguese and that they were translations of somebody else's poems, hence sonnets from the Portuguese, but also Robert Browning used to refer to her as his little Portuguese, and so that lends a much more tender, poignant note to the volume of poetry. I'm going to start off with form and structure for this poem, and because its title refers to its structure. So, a sonnet is a 14-line love poem, and this sonnet in particular is a Petrarchan sonnet or an Italian sonnet, which means that it has iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line in a heartbeat rhythm, unstressed, stressed, da-dum, 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 da-dum. Petrarchan sonnets always have a volta, and that's usually marked between the octave, which is the first 8 lines, and the sestet, which is the final 6. This poem changes that structure slightly in that the most obvious volta, which is a turning point in the poem, the most obvious volta occurs in line 5 rather than in line 9. The rhyme scheme for a Petrarchan sonnet is ABBA, ABBA in the octave, and then some variation of C, D, and E in the sestet, and in this case it's C, D, C, D, C, D. I really like this poem. I think it seems quite intimate, I think it seems quite passionate, and I think the natural imagery is used really well as an extended metaphor throughout the poem. To begin with, in line 1, we can comment on the exclamation mark showing her passion and her enthusiasm and the meaning behind her speech. I'm assuming it's written as a her, but it doesn't have to be. There's an affectionate use of thee rather than you. So you was used at the time that this poem was written, but thee was more old-fashioned, but also more familiar and more intimate. So thee being used throughout could be seen as a significant thing. The idea behind my thoughts do twine and bud about thee. There's fresh growth with the idea of bud, and twine means to unite something, to really wind around it. So there's a sense of unity between the speaker and her lover. The enjambment between lines 1 and 2, as well as that sentence carries over, reflects that natural imagery, particularly of growth, and the idea of this vine and growing around the tree. A lovely simile there to describe her thoughts about her lover as well as wild vines about a tree. The lover is central to her thoughts and the existence of the speaker. When she's thinking about her lover, the vines, which seem wild, quite exotic, quite passionate, put out broad leaves until the point that her thoughts of her lover overwhelm the speaker, and she becomes the straggling green which actually hides the wood, hides him. This turning point in the poem comes next, yet, marking the turning point, oh my palm tree. And it's interesting to consider the significance of the palm tree as opposed to another traditional type of tree, for example, an elm or an oak or a willow. Some possible reasons, although it's interesting to think of your own interpretations for this, could be frequent biblical references, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning does write using a lot of religious imagery ordinarily. Or it could be, for example, a desert oasis, so the idea of a palm tree in the middle of somewhere dry, and a palm tree being fruitful and growing in those circumstances. It's interesting how forceful and assertive the speaker is in this poem, be it understood. It's imperative and it's decisive. She says exactly what she won't have. I will not have my thoughts instead of thee, who art dearer, better. The thought of her lover is insufficient compared to the reality of having him there. She calls on the lover to renew thy presence, as a strong tree should. And here's where it gets passionate and euphemistic. Rustle thy boughs, set thy trunk all bare, possibly phallic imagery there, and let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down. So onomatopoeia used in this line, burst, shattered, everywhere. And it's almost orgasmic in those lines of this release of pressure as she drops away from her thoughts drop away as he's actually there. Because in this deep joy to see and hear thee, and breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I am too near thee. And there's a beautiful assonance in those last few lines of the ee, elongated sound, which gives it a beautiful airy quality, I think. I've also written John 15:5 at the bottom, which is a Bible verse. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, Elizabeth Barrett Browning often uses religious imagery. And the verse that I'm referring to is, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Which I think is a really complementary Bible verse that matches this poem. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning was very religious and therefore is likely to have been aware of that particular imagery. So it's very interesting that she uses that in her poem too. Thank you very much for listening.